They did. They tried to bring him back, I believe, under the first Congress under President Clinton, but a direct mail campaign did a pretty good job of stopping that.
So we've talked a little bit about a lot of the issues in doing radio. It's just paperwork, though, when you get down to it. It's not an insurmountable amount that you need to go through. And it is possible to get your own radio station started in one way, shape, or form. Isn't this just the entry slide for Hole Punch More?
I believe so.
Let's see what's next.
Yes. Low power FM is a pretty recent thing. It was first, as pioneers, a concept really by the FCC 5 years ago. This is a carryover, actually, of many, many years ago. There existed what was called a Class D broadcasting radio station, which is a small 10-watt radio station generally owned by a non-commercial entity designed for more experimental radio purposes, not professional kind of thing. And then during the whole deregulation of the 1980s, they got rid of that class structure. Any station that existed under that class structure still exists under that class structure, but no new licenses were issued under that class structure. Then more recently, in 2000, the FCC floated the LPFM idea and wanted to get a sort of a pilot program going to try it out, see how it worked exclusively as a non-commercial broadcast medium, and issued some sort of provincial licenses that had the National Association of Broadcasters rather fearful. And so the National Association of Broadcasters went to Congress.
Let me interrupt you for a second. If you haven't, LPFM is low power FM, really low, and so lower entry costs. We're talking, when I say low entry costs, it's still $10,000 to get a radio station started. What's the power range?
Low power FM is defined as 100 watts or less, so it's an improvement over the Class D license structure.
Also, looser paperwork and filing requirements to make it easier for community groups to get into the radio market and start their own things.
And for reference, that 100-watt power limit will basically get you a 4 to 6 mile broadcast radius.
Depending on height.
Depending on height, depending on a number of other factors that affect the wonderful, wonderful, fun world of radio frequency. But that's the general ballpark, small community areas, small cities, things like that. But you wouldn't say hit the entire Cleveland market with a low power FM signal. You'd hit a small portion of it, the downtown area, the west side, something like that.
You can see from the background on our lovely presentation where WREW's 15,000 watts gets it. I have no clue how it would scale back when it was 100.
And that's not entirely accurate. That's basically a technical map. There's some variation on that based on terrain factors that weren't accounted for. So don't count that for accuracy.
So low power FM basically was a way for community groups to get into the radio market really easily. But what happened then, Jim? Go.
Okay, this is my rant now against the National Association of Broadcasters, and in many ways also the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, because they really drove this idea as well. They basically shat themselves over low power FM and went to Congress and said, hey, these guys could, interfere with us. Yeah, we'll go with that. Interfere with us in terms of broadcast. So clearly, no LPFM station should be allowed to exist within 3 channels of any currently existing broadcast station. There was born the third adjacent rule. And basically what it is the broadcast frequency is channelized. You know, you have 91.1, 91.3. Basically every 200 kilohertz is a new FM channel. And the third adjacent rule is that if I have a full broadcast station at 91.1 megahertz, no station can exist at 91.3, 91.5, 91.7, 90.9, 90.7, or 90.5. So that's a pretty huge swath of bandwidth that's just cut out. The FCC, of course, complained about this, and yes, we have a Notacon radio mic now, so we're on Notacon radio. But the FCC said that's stupid, and, well, they were right. But the Congress, you know, being bought and paid for by the National Association of Broadcasters, passed legislation that enforced this act. So basically, to set up a new LPFM station in any market, you have to find a stretch of bandwidth that is clear for 7 adjacent channels.
Good luck.
Yeah, seriously. I've searched around Cleveland. No such space exists. Any basically major radio market will have no such space. The FCC then commissioned a study to find out if a station on a 3rd adjacent channel would actually interfere. And the study found that said no chance in hell that it will ever interfere with the station. I'll get to your question in a second. So the FCC then submitted this report to Congress, and a few people in Congress have been trying to get the 3rd adjacent rule removed a number of times. A number of pieces of legislation have been floated, but the revocation of the rule has yet to be passed. The current incarnation of it is, I want to say, Localism and Broadcasting Act, introduced by Senator John McCain in January. And hopefully that may make some progress. We'll see how it goes. Your question? Yes.
You're bringing up logic.
But see, they were licensed. Yes, logically it doesn't make any sense. The technical explanation there is that they were licensed in existence before the 3rd adjacent rule was written and enforced. So by nature of being pre-existing, they were allowed to remain in existence. Yes, although very few new commercial licenses have been issued in the past 5 years. Basically, commercial licenses are issued every so often. The FCC will have an auction. If it finds a stretch of bandwidth in a particular market, they'll say, hey, we'll have an auction off this bandwidth. And all the big broadcasters show up, Clear Channel, Infinity, et cetera, try to get their bid in there, and then, highest bidder wins, which of course blocks out everybody but the big commercial broadcasters.
If anyone's been paying any attention to HDTV, this is why the FCC is really, really looking forward to pushing them off of that bandwidth into HDTV so that they can re-auction off that band of the spectrum.
Yeah,
that's a whole other issue.
The U.S. budget makes that like a bandit on bandwidth auctions.
And generally the consumer loses because it closes down. Suddenly there's no longer space for community involvement. Remember that most commercial radio stations are working off of, computerized jukebox system essentially, with a limited library, I'd say. Many
of them are even driven off of a nationally centered program list. So a lot of commercial radio is just driven by a centralized national broadcaster.
Okay, we can talk about this for a while too.
Indeed.
So, we've talked briefly about what you need to transmit. I meant drop that $10,000. Simplest setup that you could possibly have to do a radio station, right? A microphone, CD player, something to mix it, and the transmitter that's possibly on the tower. First, however many things I said are pretty cheap and commodity type items. Transmitters are expensive. The reason that they're expensive is because you have to license them through they have to be FCC licensed, and you have to bring in technical people to ensure that you're not infringing on anyone else, that you're not violating any, they call it environmental interference, which is basically that someone walking near your transmitter won't become sterile instantly. And similar types of issues.
And then basically on top of that, the FCC licensing process, really there are sort of 2 phases to that, is that you get issued a construction permit, and you have a certain amount of time to execute that, to actually get your structure up and operational. Then before you can make it operational, you then have to get the actual operating license on top of after the construction is complete, after the construction license and everything like that. So it's sort of a 2-step process there even.
Now, I don't want to drive anyone away from thinking about getting involved in community radio at one point, even though we basically been saying that it's very, very tough. it's a big project, but it's not impossible. Particularly if you have people who are motivated and interested in getting involved. Now, the fact that the FCC isn't offering low power FM licenses right now is a whole other issue. Did you talk about that, Jim?
No, basically they're waiting at the moment until they don't want to get into the process of it until the third adjacent rule is gotten rid of. And a number of the other provisions in the current incarnation of getting rid of the third adjacent rule is it would require basically low power community stations to take priority over translator stations, which exist only to rebroadcast a signal from another station. Actually, there's been a giant network developed over the past 10 years of religious translators, basically systems that rebroadcast religious radio. It's one of the interesting things. Odd rules about translators are that if it's a commercial translator, the translator itself has to be located within the original broadcast range of the central source, so that it's only rebroadcasting and extending your coverage area a little bit. For non-commercial translators, and this includes religious organizations, the translator can be located wherever you want, fed from whatever source, satellite, anything like that. So if you have a religious station in San Jose, California, you can get a translator in upstate New York. It doesn't make much sense at all, but it's how it's being used. So you have these giant translator networks of religious broadcasting that are being set up across America just because there are no restrictions on translators right now, just restrictions on
there are
FM.
restrictions, but they're not.
They're significantly less than the restrictions on low power FM.
And of course, you'd like your studio to be sound insulated, and you want to have some music or something ridiculous like that. And you go to radio conventions and people walk around having who has a bigger penis contest about how much power their radio station puts out,
or how slick their digital mixing console is, things of that nature.
Yeah. It's a good thing we always win.
That's right.
Oh, goody.
Our favorite topic.
This is a whole talk in of itself. We're going to do it in about 5 minutes, I think. First of all, something that we haven't talked about before we even get to what we have on this slide is webcasting is certainly a viable option for a ground phase for a community radio project.
And a number of community radios have set up not really as broadcasters, just as webcasters.
It's a good gateway into getting a broadcast license later on. So for one thing, you actually can get listeners that way. As more people get broadband at home, for instance, you can, and with sufficient advertising, you can get into people's homes. Has much lower startup costs. Webcasting through, for instance, Live 365, last time I checked, is like $1,200, $1,300 a year for 50 concurrent users, or you can do it yourself. Which a lot of people do. Also, there's no regulatory environment. Right? You can say whatever you want, anytime you want, and the only people you're going to piss off are your listeners, and then they stop listening.
And, the internet, of course, is not channelized, so you don't have to worry about interference from other webcasters and things of that nature.
This runs into our very first topic, which is the DMCA, which everyone here should hate with a blinding passion. If you don't, I hope I can convince you. When it comes to digital media, the DMCA basically says that any digital copy is a perfect copy. That means that my 56K MP3 stream that you can get on wrw.org is a perfect copy of the CD original. And as a result, we have to license it as such. So we pay, as a non-commercial and educational broadcaster, we don't have to pay through the nose for it, but we do have to pay
a statutory annual fee, I believe.
Yeah. It's a company called Sound Exchange which administers it and throws money around hypothetically to the artists who deserve it. But by the time you get past their overhead, the cost of simply administering the whole project,
the general filtration of the money through the record labels themselves.
So that's all the DMCA's fault. You can blame them for perfect digital copies. And which actually put out, if anyone remembers, when Small Webcasters Act or something along those lines? Some Webcasting Act was passed, and not too long ago, a whole bunch of internet sort of radio stations went out of existence because they simply couldn't pay it. If you had a community organization to